Today we're going to start Chapter 10. Chapter 10 deals with economic growth, the financial system, and business cycles. Now we're going to focus on the importance of long-run economic growth, the roles of the financial system in facilitating long-run economic growth, and then we're going to explain what happens during the business cycle. Now, a successful economy is capable of increasing production of goods and services faster than the growth in its population. Now, we all want the United States to have a strong economy. And the reason why is because hopefully that will result in a better life for us as citizens. Now, in this chapter, we're going to discuss what it means for the economy to be strong or weak. And then also, what are some of the factors that contribute to a strong or weak economy? Now, when discussing long-run economic growth, we're going to be analyzing the process by which rising productivity increases the average standard of living. So by definition, long-run economic growth is going to look at the process by which rising productivity increases the average standard of living. Now, we discussed very briefly the short-run swings in the economy due to the business cycle in our chapter on GDP. Now, the business cycle by definition is going to be these alternating periods of economic expansion where we see that real GDP is going to be increasing or an upturn in the economy. And then we also have economic recessions where we'll see that real GDP is going to be decreasing and it's going to be considered a downturn in the economy. Now, one thing to remember is that each period of expansion is not the same length, nor is each period of the recession. Now, the most utilized tool that we use to measure the average standard of living is going to be real GDP per capita. Now, the term real GDP just means that it's adjusted for changes in the price level, and then the term per capita just means per person. Now, since economic growth is so important, we're going to track our growth rates from year to year using a simple growth formula. Now, a growth formula is just going to be new minus old over the old. So that's how you can find the growth formula for anything. So the growth formula is going to be equal to new minus old over old. Now, we'll also multiply it by 100 to give us a number that's easier to work with. And now this is similar to what we did when we were calculating our inflation rate. So our inflation rate represented the increase in the price level from year to year. So we can apply that same concept here with finding our increase in GDP or real GDP per capita from year to year. So let's look at this example that we have. Now we have our 2015 value for real GDP. And then we also have our 2016 value of real GDP. So we'll always use the most recent year as the new values. And the previous years as the old one. So plugging it into our formula, new minus the old all over the old times 100. So we see that from 2015 to 2016, real GDP increased by 1.6%. Now we can also, after finding the growth rate, we can also take the average over a few years. Now, of course, to find the average of anything, you just sum up the number and divide it by however many there are. So in our case here, we have our values for 2014, 2015, and then 2016. So all you do is just add up those values. And then divided by however many there are. So we have 3. So times 100, that gives us our average annual real GDP growth of 2.2%. Now, lastly, in terms of calculating our growth rate, we can judge how rapidly an economic variable grows by calculating how many years it will take to double. Now, that is where this rule of 70 comes into play. So, an easy way to calculate how many years it'll take real GDP per capita to double is to use the rule of 70. Now, the formula for this rule is the number of years to double is going to be equal to 70, where the rule of 70 gets its name from, divided by whatever the growth rate is, because that should be a constant number. Now, if the growth rate is 5% here, so we would just say 70 over 5, which is equal to 14. So if the United States had a steady growth rate of 5%, it would take 14 years for our real GDP to double. Now, small differences in growth rate can have large effects on how rapidly the standard of living in a country increases. Now, increases in real GDP per capita rely heavily on increases in labor productivity. So increases in real GDP per capita rely heavily on increases in labor productivity. Now, economists usually measure labor productivity as output per hour of work in order to avoid fluctuations in the length of the workday and then also in the fraction of the population employed. Now, economists believe two key factors determine labor productivity, and that is going to be the quantity of capital and then also the level of technology. So let's look at those two variables. So starting with capital. So going back to our definition of capital that I believe we had in chapter 1, that's going to be anything that's man-made or woman-made that contributes to the production process. So for Domino's, it may be a pizza oven. For Apple, it could be the machinery that they use to make their iPhones. That's going to serve as capital. So to increase labor productivity, we need to have an increase in these areas. So an increase in capital per hour worked. Now, the total amount of physical capital available in a country is known as the country's capital stock. As the capital stock per hour worked increases, worker productivity increases. So the more capital a worker has available to use, the more productive that worker will be. Now, this also includes that human capital. And we talked about human capital referring to like the accumulated knowledge and skills workers acquire from education and training or even from their life experiences. So increases in human capital also stimulate economic growth. Now, economic growth also depends more on technological changes than on increases in capital worked per hour. Technological changes and increase in the quantity of output firms can produce using a given quantity of inputs. So improvements in capital or methods to combine inputs into outputs once again allows workers to produce more in a given period of time. Now, most technological changes are going to be embodied in new machinery or equipment or software, so swapping out one for another. Now, in implementing technological change, entrepreneurs are very important. Now, the reason why this is because they make the crucial decisions about whether to introduce new technology to produce better or lower cost products, and then entrepreneurs also decide whether to allocate the firm's resources to research and development that can result in new technologies. Now, a key requirement for economic growth is also that the government must provide secure rights to private property, so these property rights. Now, the government can aid growth by establishing independent court systems, once again to help define those property rights. So moving on to potential GDP. Now, potential GDP, which we'll just say is Y sub P, is going to be the level of real GDP attained when all firms are operating at capacity. So when all firms are operating at capacity or their full potential. Now keep in mind that capacity refers to normal operation, so the normal hours of operation and also the normal amount of workers. So that means that there's no extra workers that are working outside of the norm, or the firm isn't extended or have hours extended past what their normal hours of operation. Now, potential GDP will increase over time as the labor force grows. The more workers you have, the greater your potential for the amount that you're able to produce. So the potential GDP will increase over time as the labor force grows. That means that new factories and offices buildings are being built, new machinery and equipment are being installed, and technological changes are taking place. This table illustrates that oftentimes we're not producing at our potential. Sometimes our actual real GDP, so actual GDP is denoted as Y sub A, and we have our potential GDP as Y sub P. So sometimes our actual GDP may be below our potential. So right here, we see that our actual output is less than our potential. When this occurs, that normally means that there's a recession. And then there's other cases, like right here, where we see that our actual output is greater than our potential. Now in Chapter 12, we will explore how the economy responds when we are producing above or below our potential and some of the ramifications. Now, as we shift gears to the financial system, economic growth depends on the ability of firms to expand their operations. Now, firms can finance some of their own expansions through retained earnings, which is reinvesting profits back into the firm, also through financial markets and through financial intermediaries. Now, the financial system, by definition, is going to be the system of financial markets and financial intermediaries through which firms acquire funds from households. Now, moving on to financial markets, this slide gives an overview of what financial markets entail. So by definition, financial markets are markets where financial securities, such as stocks and bonds, are bought and sold. And then we have some basic definitions for financial securities, stocks, and bonds. And then we also have our outline for financial intermediaries. So these are going to be our firms such as banks, mutual fund, pension funds, and insurance companies that borrow funds from savers and lend them to borrowers. Now, you'll go more in depth with these types of markets and financial intermediaries in upper division economics courses, or even in some of your finance courses. Now, the financial system provides three key services for savers and borrowers that are outlined on this next slide here. Now, those three key services are risk sharing, liquidity, and information. And you're given the definitions for those on this slide. Now let's look at the market for loanable funds. Now the market for loanable funds refer to the interaction of borrowers and lenders that determines the market interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds exchanged. So the demand for loanable funds is determined by the willingness of firms to borrow money and engage in new investment projects. So we have the demand, and as you see, it's going to be this downward sloping line. Oops. So our demand curve is always going to be downward sloping, representing this inverse relationship between the quantity of loanable funds and the real interest rate. So what we see is that the lower the interest rate, the more investment projects a firm can profitably undertake. Now the supply of loanable funds is going to be determined by the willingness of households to save and by the extent of government saving or dissavings. So the higher the interest rate, the greater reward, or the greater the reward for savings, and the larger the amount of funds households will save. So we have this upward sloping supply curve representing this direct or this positive relationship between the quantity of loanable funds and the interest rate. Now, I always use the analogy with credit cards. When are you more likely to spend money on goods or services? If your interest rate on your credit card is 1% or 27%. Now, of course, we know that the 1% interest rate entices spending and the 27% does not. So if people are not spending money, then they're going to be saving it. Also, you can kind of ask, when are you more likely to keep money in the bank? If they're paying you a 10% interest rate or a 1% interest rate. Now, of course, it would be if the 10% interest rate was in effect. Once again, higher interest rates just encourage saving. Now, because both borrowers and lenders are interested in the real interest rate they receive or pay, equilibrium in the market for loanable funds determines the interest rate. So we always find our equilibrium point where our supply curve and our demand curve intersect, which is going to be right here. And that gives us our equilibrium interest rate and also our equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. Now, we draw the demand curve for loanable funds by holding constant all factors other than the interest rate that will affect the willingness of borrowers to demand funds. And we draw our supply curve, once again, holding constant all factors other than the interest rate that affect the willingness of lenders to supply those funds. So therefore, an increase in demand for loanable funds, such as we have right here. So we have this increase in demand represented by this rightward shift of the demand curve. So an increase in demand results in an increase in our equilibrium rate and an increase in our equilibrium quantity. So we see we're going up from interest rate 1 to interest rate 2 here. Maybe it went from 3% to 5%. And we have an increase in the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. Maybe it went from, just rough numbers, 4 trillion to 5 trillion. So anytime there's an increase in the demand for loanable funds, that's going to cause the interest rates to go up and also the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds to go up. Now, since this is a topic covered in more upper division macro courses, I mainly just want you to focus on what happens to the equilibrium interest rate and quantity of loanable funds when there's a change in demand or supply of loanable funds. Now, the following tables will kind of help illustrate those changes. We see that if there is a decrease in supply, as we have here on this first one, so we have this decrease in supply. Whenever there's a decrease in supply, we're going to see that the real interest rate is going to increase and investment is going to decrease. If there's a decrease in investment, that means that our loanable funds are going to go down, or the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds are going to go down. Then we also see what happens if there is an increase in supply. We would expect the real interest rate to decrease and investment is going to increase. So as the quantity of loanable funds are going to go up. And then we have our changes in demand. So if there's an increase in demand, we see that the real interest rate and the level of investment is going to increase. So if our interest rate was at 3% and we started at $5 billion, when there's an increase in the demand for loanable funds, that's going to drive the interest rate up to maybe 4%. Oops. And maybe $6 billion for our equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. And then lastly, if there's a decrease in demand. So whenever there's a decrease in demand, we will expect the real interest rate and the level of investment to both go down. So that's what I want you guys to just kind of focus on. What happens when there's an increase in demand or supply of loanable funds, and how does that affect the overall interest rate and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds? Now, since at least the early 19th century, the U.S. economy has experienced business cycles. So these business cycles are going to be these alternating periods of expanding and contracting economic activity. Now, the business cycle is going to consist of 4 phases. So we have the phase of rising, which is going to be the expansionary phase. Now, during periods of expansion, we're going to see that real GDP is increasing because as we look at our business cycle, on our vertical axis we have real GDP, on our horizontal axis we have time, so the years. So real GDP is going to be increasing. Now, during times of economic expansion, this means that real GDP goes up. We're also going to see that unemployment goes down because more people are going to be working. And then also incomes are going to increase because more people are working. So these are going to be some of the things that occur during economic expansions. There's going to be an increase in real GDP, there's going to be an increase in incomes, and a decrease in the unemployment rate. Now, we also have periods of recession. Recessions are going to be downturns in the economy, so downturn in economic activity. Now, during periods of recessions, we see real GDP is going down. Now, as real GDP goes down, that's going to cause unemployment to go up. And as more people are unemployed, incomes are going to go down. So these are going to be our economic recessions. Now, we also have those points where we change from one phase to the other. So that's going to be peaks, which is where real GDP reaches its max during that portion of the business cycle. And then we also have the trough, where real GDP bottoms out. So typically a business cycle is going from one peak to another peak, or from one trough to another trough, and that's how we typically measure the business cycles. Now, one of the basic definitions that we use, or that we see is utilized, the textbook refers to as this media definition of a recession, and that's 2 consecutive quarters of declining real GDP. So for 2 consecutive quarters, or for 6 months straight, there's a decrease in real GDP. Now, economists use this more elaborate definition. Now, they defined a recession as a significant decline in activity spread across the economy, lasting more than a few months, visible in industrial production, employment, real income, and wholesale retail trade. Now, each of these are going to be some of the leading and coinciding and lagging indicators of economic growth within the business cycle, which is why economists pay attention to them. Now, there's monthly reports that come out, actually there's weekly reports that come out for some of these indicators that the Bureau of Labor Statistics pays close attention to. So let's look at what happens during the business cycle. Now, during periods of economic expansion, we typically see an increase in spending. So actually, let me write this out. During periods of economic expansion, typically that means that there's going to be an increase in total spending. When the economy is doing good, people have a lot of extra money in their pockets, so they're going to spend that money on goods and services. Now, as spending increases, firms need to increase their output to keep up with the demand. So there's going to be an increase in output, which we'll refer to on an aggregate level as real GDP. So I'll just put output in parentheses above that. So when there's an expansion, well, during periods of expansion, total spending is going up, which means that firms need to increase their output to keep up with the demand for their products. And now, as they increase their output and are most likely operating above capacity, they also increase the number of workers that they have, thus, unemployment decreases. So, they hire more workers. Because in order to increase your output, you need more workers. As a result of hiring more workers, once again, unemployment goes down. Now, as they hire more workers, this is going to lead to incomes going up, because more people working means an economy where there's more money flowing. So income is increasing within the economy, which allows them to spend more, because as income goes up, people have more money to spend, and we see that the cycle kind of repeats itself. So this is what happens during periods of economic expansions. So total spending is going up, which causes firms to increase the amount that they're producing. As they need to increase their output, they have to hire more workers. As they hire more workers, those workers get paid, so they're making more money. And that money that they're making, they're spending on goods and services. Now, near the end of an expansion, we see that interest rates are rising. The wages of workers are rising faster than other prices, and then that's causing firms' profits to fall. Now, as a recession begins, let me write that up here. Because we're going to see that the same things are going to be affected. So whenever there's a recession, spending is going to be down. So there's going to be a decrease in total spending because the economy is not in really good shape during recessions. So people kind of unsure of what their financial outlook looks like, they're going to decrease their spending. Now with a decrease in total spending, now we'll see that firms aren't able to sell as much as they were, so firms don't need to produce as much as they were previously because inventory is starting to pile up or accumulate of the items that they can't sell. So they're going to cut back on production. So there's going to be a decrease in output. Now, if firms are cutting back on the amount that they're producing, they're not going to need as many workers. So they're going to start laying off workers. Now, as more workers get laid off, that's going to cause our unemployment rate to go up. As more people are being laid off, incomes across the economy are going to start to go down, as a lot of people are going to be out of work. And with incomes going down, that's less money that people have to spend, which once again feeds into the recession. So we see total spending is going to continue to decrease. Real GDP will continue to go down as output falls. More workers are going to be laid off, causing our unemployment rate to go up, which in turn causes incomes to decrease. So this is going to continue to happen into some form of intervention or improvement in economic conditions. Now, this slide illustrates how producers of durable goods and non-durable goods are affected differently by the recession. We see that during recessions, firms selling durable goods are more likely to be hit harder by a recession. And the reason why is because most consumers continue to buy non-durable goods like food and clothing, even during periods of economic recessions. And lastly, let's look at how the business cycle affects inflation. Now remember, we said that during times of economic expansion, total spending is going up. Now as a result of an increase in demand for products, firms will likely increase the price of their product. So during expansions, demand for product is high, resulting in increases in prices, as we talked about in chapter 3 on a micro level. So when we look at it on an aggregate level, when prices are increasing, this means that the price level is going up. Now, an increase in the price level results in inflation. So during periods of economic expansions, we have to be cognizant of the potential for inflation. Now, during recessions, we saw that demand for products is low relative to supply, resulting in prices increasing slower or even decreasing. Now, if you recall when we looked at our chapter on inflation, if there's a decrease in the rate of inflation, so prices are still going up, but at a slower rate, that's going to be disinflation, or we can say a low inflation. And then if prices are going down, that's going to be deflation, where we're looking at on an aggregate level, prices are decreasing. So I hope this helps as you prepare for the assignments for this unit. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me an email.